Hello and welcome to Wrestling at Random. I'm Jeremy Deemer.
And I am Adam Summers.
This is the podcast where every week we'll review a classic pro wrestling event from a streaming service.
That classic pro wrestling event could be a pay-per-view, it could be a TV special, a original home video, it could be a major event from a Japanese wrestling streaming service, as we had on the last episode of this podcast. Pretty much anything that is not a episode of weekly television from a major pro wrestling company.
No, and this week, this event is a pay-per-view event from the WWF In Your House Canadian Stampede 1997, taking you back to July 6th of 1997. Let's go all the way back to give you a little history about Calgary wrestling. Let's talk about Stampede Wrestling. That was formed in 1948 by Stu Hart. Originally named Klondike Wrestling, it became the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance's Calgary territory. In August of 1967, Stu changed it to Stampede Wrestling. And in 1982, Stampede ended up withdrawing from the NWA. Stu Hart's children would all compete for Stampede Wrestling. Smith, Bruce, Keith, Wayne, Dean, Ross, and the most famous being Bret Hart and Owen Hart. Stu and Helen Hart had 12 children. The men were wrestlers, and the women married wrestlers. The Hart family is considered a wrestling dynasty, not just for their accomplishments as promoters and wrestlers, but also as trainers. The Hart family dungeon would go on to train wrestling stars for another generation of talent. In August of 1984, Stampede Wrestling was sold to the World Wrestling Federation. In 1997, WCW and WWF were in their heated wrestling war. The Hart Foundation were the top heel group in the company, and with this being the first major match with Bret Hart since returning from knee surgery, and the first pay-per-view show ever in Calgary, the dynamic would be completely different. These hated bad guys would be heavily cheered, while they would go back to their bad guy personas after this show. This show would be a celebration of what the Hart family meant to Calgary. And that leads us to our opening video package, explaining what I just mentioned there, that Bret Hart was a beloved good guy, but the emergence of Stone Cold Steve Austin and their feud made Bret the villain and Steve the fan favorite. But tonight's show is a return to Calgary for the Hart Foundation, so they will be the returning heroes, and the regular favorites will be hated. And I know how hot Canadian crowds can be, so I was super excited for this show to start. And we are starting the show in the Saddle Dome in Calgary, Alberta, Canada.
Well, first with that video open, though, I just want to mention that you go back and you look at this era of WWF and they talk about, shades of gray, and that being one of the things that brought in a new fan base, that it wasn't just, white bread baby faces and sort of over the top heels. They literally in the video open talk about shades of gray as they lay out, they say those words.
And the footage is in black and white. Yeah.
Yes. A nice touch. They say that we're in Calgary, Alberta, where the paradox continues. In a lot of ways, this was the beginning of what we would see really still to this day, when the WWF, later to become the WWE, goes to Canada and they know that they are going to have different crowd reactions than you would normally have here. They always talk about it's the bizarro world. Like they try to give that disclaimer at the beginning that, oh, if the crowd is booing Roman Reigns or they're booing John Cena, like, don't take that seriously. Don't believe it. Even though a lot of times it's not just in Canada that's happening. It was real here as far as it really was a bizarro world. Later on, they would go on to use that as a crutch to explain their own booking failures in the future. But that was definitely not what we were seeing here. It was also a little bit weird, Jeremy, because I know we talked about this when the randomizer chose this show. This is considered, this is a very well-regarded WWF pay-per-view. I was ordering pay-per-views around this time. I did not order this show back then. And it's one of those weird blind spot shows that I know I should have watched, I had never seen this show until we watched this, reviewing it, which is crazy when you look at what's on this card. I have never seen the show until we did this.
I am with you 100% because I also did not see the show. In 1997, I was very deep into WCW at that time. So this, to me, was a missable show. And wow, I was wrong. And I had always heard about the lore of how good this show was. And yeah, me sitting down to watch it for this podcast is the first time I've watched this show myself. So I really, I feel like I punched my wrestling fan card and got this this show off the list because I'm glad I got the randomizer chose it. I had never seen it either.
It's noteworthy as well. This is a 4-match show as far as the pay-per-view broadcast. The broadcast is only an hour and 48 minutes. There was one pre-show match on the free-for-all, as they called it back then. It was the Godwins, Henry O. Godwin, who had a cameo appearance in the previous In Your House show from 1995 that we've reviewed on this podcast, teaming with his brother, Phineas Godwin, which, again, they wrestled in WCW several years prior as Tex Slazenger and Shanghai Pierce. That was not who they were here. They defeated the new Blackjacks, which were Blackjack Bradshaw, that being JBL, and Blackjack Wyndham. Barry Windham, basically taking the moniker of his dad as a Blackjack Mulligan. He was Blackjack Wyndham here. We'll talk about it later. It just fascinates me that this show had Barry Windham and the great Sasuke in the same locker room. This is just a very interesting show, but yeah, the broadcast only 4 matches.
The show attendance was 12,151 in the building. Gate was $229,598, along with another $65,000 in merchandise. Those two figures at the time were the largest in each category in the history of pro wrestling in Calgary. So
yeah, I believe
this
it.
was a big deal.
Based off of how enthusiastic this crowd was, it makes sense that they were buying tickets and they were buying merch.
The announcers, of course, are Vince McMahon, Jim Ross, and Jerry Lawler. Everyone has a cowboy hat on because Calgary.
Yes, basically. It was also funny that we almost never saw Vince McMahon's face on this show. The cowboy hat, I guess the way the lighting was, his entire face was pretty much darkened. You couldn't see him the whole show. Not that bothered me. He was certainly at his Vinciest throughout, particularly in the match involving 2 Japanese stars, which actually, when they start this show, after we have the it's the classic In Your House set. There's a ton of pyro and Canadian flags. Then Vince welcomes us to the Canadian Stampede, says we are across the border in magnificent Calgary. And then Vince starts talking about it, even though it's not going to be coming up next. He says, what about this great Japanese match we're going to see? And those were not words I would ever expect to hear coming out of the mouth of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. It truly is bizarro world here in Calgary.
Yeah, he was almost just double checking that JR did some research because he was not prepared for that match.
No, he was not.
But the opening match everyone was prepared for. That was Hunter Hearst Helmsley, 1997 King of the Ring, managed by China, to take on Mankind. And this
Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say this is a rematch from last month's King of the Ring, where Helmsley won with tons of interference from China.
Yes, and we learned that in a video feature, they very over-the-top cheesy Doc Hendricks voiceover, where he's trying so hard to not sound like Doc Hendricks / Michael PSAs, but he still does sound like him. We see a pedigree through the table, a scepter to the head by China. He wins the King of the Ring, and then the next night, Mankind goes after him and just gets beaten down again. The most noteworthy thing to me here, though, was the introduction of Triple H. Again, we go back to the Hunter Hearst Helmsley of the previous 1995 In Your House show that we talked about on this podcast. Then he had the very frilly shirt. They were going over the top with him as basically like an American European, like the American aristocrat. Here he had the music, but his hair was not done in the same way. He had this green, like dark green robe rather than the frilly shirt. So we're already starting to see the changes in the character. And even when we heard him talking on the video feature, he didn't have quite as much of that terrible,
weird
forced,
accent.
weird American aristocrat accent.
Ugh. Well, Mankind hits the ring and they start out quickly. Lots of brawling. Mankind is very popular with the Canadian crowd.
He's a master of mayhem, according to Vince McMahon.
All Mankind early, including a double arm DDT.
And a bow immediately afterwards, a curtsy, which was just watching Mankind, Mick Foley in 1997, do a curtsy. The crowd enjoyed that.
Yeah, doing Helmsley's pose got a big reaction. And Helmsley was backdropped over the top rope to the floor, and we got the Cactus Jack elbow off the apron to the floor. I love that move. And on this podcast, many times we said, hey, that move needs to come back. Someone needs to bring that move back. This is the time where I say, I love that move, but that should not come back ever.
No, I 100% agree with you. A lot of people see Mick Foley walking around now, and I mean, they think, him hobbling is due to, getting thrown off the top of a cage, getting thrown through a cage, all the other bumps that he took. I would be willing to wager that nothing took a greater toll on him long-term than the dozens, if not hundreds of times that he did that bang, bang elbow drop off the apron of the floor, landing directly on his right hip. Yeah, don't need to see that come back. I did think it was interesting that Jim Ross referenced Mankind's Cactus Jack days.
Yes, we did get a Cactus Jack reference.
That was one of the, JR was very energized on this show, and he was working really hard to get in anything like that he could throughout this evening.
Helmsley and Mankind fighting up the ramp. Mankind suplexes him onto the metal ramp. Absolutely brutal. Helmsley with a sunset flip attempt as he comes back into the ring, but Mankind counters with a mandible claw. Chyna's able to break it up by punching Mankind in a way that the ref could not see it over the top of the referee there. So the first Chyna interference in the match. Mankind and Helmsley back on the floor. Hunter throws Mankind into Chyna, who grabs him like she's going to body slam him on the floor, but then she just lets him go, and he comes down back first onto the floor, and his legs go across the metal steps. I screamed, audibly yelled while watching that. It was so awful.
Horrifying. So this was, to me, what it looked like was, you described it correctly, but it looked like Chyna just straight up hip tossed him into the steps, and it was nasty. I guess when I said about his hip and the elbow drop, you could put an asterisk and say this did a number on his hip as well. This was horrifying, and this was, I guess, both in terms of kayfabe and for real. This was Mick Foley at his trying to impress everyone in WWF the most, and that actually was a theme of this match of the commentary. We hear multiple times both Jim Ross and Vince McMahon talk about Mankind is. He wants respect from his peers, and he wants love from the fans, and he's starting to achieve that. But he was definitely out for some respect for real too here. It led him to take some horrific bumps that I'm sure even he would say probably he wishes he hadn't.
The back of his knee hitting the corner of that step, absolutely awful.
Yeah,
it hurts my knee just watching that. Helmsley follows up with a chair shot to the leg. Chop block on the injured leg as Mankind was getting back in the ring. Helmsley working over the leg. One of my favorite spots. Helmsley tries to whip Mankind into the corner, but Mankind crumbles to the mat. Can't run on the injured leg.
Yes, that's
love
something
that every time it happens.
We've had that on a few different shows we've reviewed, and it's something that it's always great. It's one of those things that, because again, wrestling physics dictate that you get thrown to the rope unless you are physically stopping and reversing. You must run to the rope. But here, wrestling physics can't 100% apply because the man's knee is too injured. Love it.
We had a figure four by Helmsley. Mankind got back into control after an inadvertent low blow.
Well, one other thing I wanted to say, another move that I liked, we had a first rope elbow drop onto the knee by Hunter Hearst Helmsley here. The type of deal where you drape the guy's leg over the first rope, and a lot of times, Ric Flair and others, they'll sort of just go up and land with their rear end. Yeah, just sort of let the bottom drop out, all the weight onto the knee. Here, Triple H did an elbow drop instead. I really liked that.
Mankind goes to nail him with a pile driver, and I always described it as like the lazy man's pile driver, where he just pulls him up by the tights and falls backward.
Yeah, it's the short pile driver. No, it's awesome. It is a move, actually. You could do that short pile driver pulling by the tights in the old No Mercy game for N64. I always liked that one.
It was almost a 3 count, very close near fall. Clothesline, and both men go over the top rope to the floor. Hunter with a chair to the leg while the ref was distracted by China. This allows China to hit Mankind with a big clothesline on the floor. Hunter has improved so much since we saw him on the In Your House 95 show, episode 1 of this podcast that you mentioned earlier. That was just 2 years ago, and in this match, holy cow, he has improved significantly.
He was great here. And again, I thought he was good back then, but no, he was great. And the other thing that was readily apparent here is that these guys, which you wouldn't have necessarily thought, these guys had amazing chemistry together right off the bat, and they would go on to have, even more historic matches. Yeah. The Royal Rumble match, was it 2000 or 2001 with the barbed wire bat and everything? Like, these two guys worked very well together. And I'd make the argument that when it came time to fully establish the Hunter Helmsley as a true main eventer, nobody was more responsible for getting him over and making that happen than Mick Foley, Mankind, Cactus Jack, and his performances with him in those matches.
Hunter gets crotched on the top turnbuckle. Mankind gets the mandible claw on while he's on the top turnbuckle. China grabs Mankind's legs, pulls him into the post.
It doesn't really work, though. She tries to crotch him on the post, but it kind of doesn't work. It came off weird. Yeah. It was maybe the only in-ring part of this match, or I should say it wasn't in-ring, it was outside of the ring, but the only true action part of this match that didn't work.
Mankind selling the low blow on the outside. The fight on the outside continues. It spills into the crowd, including fighting in the penalty box.
Of the Calgary Flames here. This is the home, and still is, as I believe now, as we record this, the oldest arena in the NHL. This is the home of the Calgary Flames. It was interesting to hear them actually mention that. There were things on this show that felt very not WWF, and that was one of them. Like them acknowledging that there was a world outside of what happened here in the World Wrestling Federation.
And then the bell rings, double count out. And
yeah, no buys on that.
No, the brawl continues all the way to the back. It was a really fun match, but wow, what a lame finish after. I was really having a good time in that match.
It was a lame finish. I agree 100%. But the thing to me that was noteworthy or notable about this was, so this is a hot opener, disappointing finish. The crowd was not upset at all. They didn't boo. They were just excited about these two guys beating the hell out of each other, brawling to the back. That was it was an omen for how good this crowd was going to be as the show went along.
The crowd was totally fine with that because they kept brawling all the way to the back. 13 minutes, 14 seconds on the opener, and great action. We cut to highlights of a parade, which included a WWF float with the Hart Foundation on it.
Well, this parade, though, this is where this was very WWF. They tried to make this sound like this whole thing was all about the WWF being in town, where this was clearly the WWF having a float and some wrestlers in the big Calgary Stampede, which is a huge event in Calgary, rodeo, and a million other things. They were a small part of the Calgary Stampede here, but that was not how it was presented. We then saw a video of Bret Hart signing autographs with fans and them saying that it was a 1 mile line and that Bret signed an autograph for every single person. There was then something called a white hat ceremony. I don't know what that was. I apologize. I didn't do additional research. And then we had a tug of war between, I don't know if it was WWF wrestlers.
WWF got a key to the city first. Then I think the wrestlers had a tug of war.
Maybe the key to the city was in the white hat, and that was the ceremony. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, and the wrestlers did win the tug of war for those keeping scores.
And it was the non-Hart wrestlers. It was like you had Goldust and the Legion of Doom, the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal in like full gear or close to full gear in the middle of the Calgary Stampede rodeo bonanza. It was quite the thing.
We cut to the locker room where Doc P.S. Hendricks is interviewing the Hart Foundation when Stone Cold immediately interrupts. But he's held back, and Hitman is explaining calmly while Stone Cold is being held back by everyone that he doesn't want it 5-on-1. He wants it 5-on-5 in the ring. Total babyface in this in this situation.
Well, that was one of the best things about WWF television at this time, was that this wasn't just a 1 week thing as far as heel or babyface with the Hart Foundation, with, you know, which country they were in would determine sort of if they were a heel or a face. This was an every week thing on TV with the Hart Foundation, where they would do some weeks of TV in Canada and they would be beloved, and then they'd be back in the US and they'd be hated, and obviously vice versa with Austin. It was pretty unique and compelling stuff that I don't recall, you know, having seen done too many times before or since.
Taka Michinoku versus the Great Sasuke.
This felt like, we've talked about on other podcasts that we've done for this show, like things that seemed like they were beamed in from another universe. This match on this show, in the environment of the WWF, where we've talked about it before, unfamiliar things usually did not get over in front of WWF crowds. It did not matter how spectacular guys were. If it wasn't sort of a, you know, guys people knew playing the hits, so to speak, it didn't work. Here we had Taka Michinoku and the Great Sasuke, arguably the two top stars of Michinoku Pro Wrestling at that point, which had started out and was a small independent company in Japan that ran in the northeastern portion of the country. Literally, that's what it meant, Northeastern Pro Wrestling. But they got hot. They started to get a following among the tape trading scene in the mid-90s, with crazy high-flying multi-man, 8-10-man tag matches, very lucha influence. On last week's podcast, we talked about Gran Hamada in that tag match on that New Japan show from 1995, and how influential he was. He was very influential on the side of Michinoku Pro Wrestling, actually wrestled for that company. And as the popularity of Michinoku Pro grew, there began to be interest in the US to have these guys come in and wrestle. And just a few months before this show, in February of 1997, the Great Sasuke, Taka Michinoku, and several other wrestlers from Michinoku Pro Wrestling appeared for ECW. They did a 6-man tag on ECW Hardcore TV, and then they were featured on the very first ever ECW pay-per-view, Barely Legal. And then just a few months later here, we have Taka Michinoku wrestling the Great Sasuke in a singles match at the Canadian Stampede. And the idea going into this, Jeremy, was that this match was happening as a showcase for Great Sasuke. Everyone assumed, and the plan was, that they were going to sign him, and Taka was here to, be his opponent, to be an opponent that he knew well and could have a great match with. And we'll see what happens.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned ECW. ECW was having great cruiserweight matches. WCW was well entrenched with their cruiserweight division and their influx of Mexican talent to that division as well. So the other rival promotions to WWF had a well-established cruiserweight division, where this was such a new thing for WWF. You had Vince McMahon calling it a light heavyweight match, Howard Finkel announcing it as a match in the junior heavyweight division. We didn't even have the name straight on what the division was called yet.
No, and there wasn't even a championship at this point. There wasn't even a title. Like, this was in its absolute infancy. It's a weird, again, we've used the phrase time capsule, but it's a weird time capsule because they could have gone a couple different ways here. They could have doubled down on bringing in guys from outside the company, like these two guys, and having, a junior heavyweight, a light heavyweight, a cruiserweight division that could have been every bit the equal that WCW had. They sadly did not go that direction. Instead, the light heavyweight division, the stop-start push that it had, was much more about, the Brian Christophers of the world than it was about these guys. But this was a trip to watch. I mean, Taka Michinoku's music hits. It's the music he would use later for many years in WWF. Vince says, "Here we go with some of the greatest athletes you'll ever feast your eyes on." And I admire his forced enthusiasm here, but you could tell Vince does not care at all.
No.
And it's so out of his element. And then
Lawler too.
Well, yeah, Lawler too. Like you said, Sasuke, or excuse me, Finkel calls it the junior heavyweight division. Vince mentions that Taka is only 23 years old and starts laughing for some reason. I don't know what that was about. And then I was very surprised to hear Great Sasuke's actual music, his actual Japanese music, is played. I did not expect that at all. But again, they were rolling out the red carpet for him. His music hits. Vince is talking about that Great Sasuke is the stuff legends are made of, and we're proud to have him here. He tries to throw it back to some like inset interview that he did with Great Sasuke, but the video doesn't play. But like, it was very clear that they were trying to win this man over to get him to sign full time.
Right after the introductions, we cut to the crowd where Helmsley and Mankind are still brawling. Helmsley's bleeding. They fight to the back. And now the match is going to begin.
Yes, they're brawling. To be clear here, this match is about to start. Taka Michinoku and the Great Sasuke there in the ring. Introductions have happened. And this isn't something to where we see footage from in the back of Triple H and Mankind fighting. They start fighting back out into the ringside area, basically almost near the penalty box where they were before. We don't. Sasuke and Taka are just apparently left to chill in the ring. Yep. They're just standing there like total geeks, which is not cool. They're forced to do that. And then finally, the refs separate them, and then boom, we just go back to the ring, and the match starts. And I felt bad for them because they were in a tough spot. The crowd, well, again, it's a Canadian crowd, so they're going to be a little bit more receptive. This crowd was not familiar with these two guys to begin with, and then they have this wild brawl between the two guys in the previous match, which they were very invested in. Then that brawls to the back again, and then okay, guys. Here, you got 10 minutes to try to win them over, and off we go.
Yeah, they literally had to win this crowd back from an ice-cold start after that brawl, interrupting right after the introductions. So
the match, the start of the match itself was awesome, though. Sasuke misses several kicks. He's sort of squared up in a kickboxing stance, and you can hear Jim Ross is one excited human being. He is fired up for this. And again, he's pushing Sasuke hard. He's talking about that Sasuke held 9 different championships before at the same time. That was the J Crown, which Ultimo Dragon held and brought all those belts to WCW at one point. JR starts talking about the tentativeness here between the men, and then talking about how the low kicks and how Inoki used low kicks as a primary offensive weapon against Muhammad Ali. JR starts talking about Tiger Mask, and Vince is like, oh yeah, I remember him. And clearly Vince had no recollection of Tiger Mask blowing everybody's minds at MSG in 1982. Sasuke hits a huge, awesome jumping spin kick, but the crowd is dead quiet, and I am concerned at this point that this match is not going to get the reaction that it deserves.
I was right there with you. After that big kick took Taka down, we got some good mat wrestling. Another big kick connects, and then the crowd finally starts to pay attention.
Yes, that pops the crowd. Sasuke then hooks a half crab on, and then I noticed that the announcers are incapable of saying Michinoku. They are all saying Michinoku.
Oh, it was so annoying. Michinoku. And yeah, I literally have that written down. Michinoku is annoying.
Yes.
After the half crab, we get a rope break which just lets more kicks from Sasuke fly. Loved it. Taka ends up catching the leg and hits a big right hand,
big palm strike, which is awesome.
Big palm strike. Sasuke sells it like he's been knocked out from the punch. And we get Taka with drop kicks. Sasuke is able to backdrop Taka sky high over the top rope to the floor, where Sasuke goes to the top rope with a kick, but Taka moves and he crashes and burns, and I thought he seriously injured his leg on that fall. That was a sick landing.
I don't think he crashed and burned here, though. I think what happened was that he did land rough, but what I think happened here was that he hits, it's a flying kick off the top rope, but it's not a drop kick. It's a 1 foot kick.
It's the 1 foot kick. Yeah.
It's basically like, if you recall what Rob Van Dam would do with his flying 1 foot kick off the top rope, that was this, but it was to the floor, but with reckless abandon. Like, it was a flying 1 foot kick, but the other foot was not doing anything safe. It was quite the visual. Vince at that point says, we haven't seen action quite like this in a long time. But imagine someone saying that sentence, but sounding completely bored while saying it. That's what happened here.
back in the ring, Sasuke with very quick, hard kicks. So his leg is okay. That was good news. Seeing such quick striking in WWF at this time was absolutely, definitely unique. That was not something you saw from other matches.
No. And then Vince says the referee should stop it. And I'm like, is Vince really concerned about the safety here? Or does he like want to end this so he can like show the Henry Godwin dark match instead?
One of Sasuke's spin kicks absolutely nailed Taka in the face, and it was so great. Taka is woozy coming out of the corner, eats another high kick on the side of the head. Taka's able to catch a kick and counter it into a dragon screw leg whip. Sasuke rolls out to the floor, and that's where we get Taka runs, leaps to the top rope, does a huge dive to the floor, nailing Sasuke. Very spectacular dive.
Incredible. This was the signature dive, the signature like ooh and ah moment for Taka Michinoku pretty much in any match, particularly when he'd go to a new company, which the Michinoku Pro guys were doing quite a bit at this time. You described it perfectly. He runs the full length of the ring, no hands, jumps to the top rope, lands on the top rope, and then immediately hits a springboard plancha, huge height to the floor. And of course, Vince McMahon says, "What a samurai warrior this Taka Michinoku is."
Yes, that's exactly what Vince said.
JR then, again, because JR is great, JR jumps in and talks about the fact that they just arrived in Calgary yesterday. Taka had been wrestling in Mexico, and so he just arrived in from Mexico while the great Sasuke had just arrived from Tokyo, which it's interesting in that Sasuke was in a very similar situation on the ECW Barely Legal show. He had wrestled Jushin Liger in the Tokyo Dome for New Japan Pro Wrestling, and then flew immediately after that show to the US, basically got off the plane, went to the ECW arena, and did that 6-man tag on that show.
Yeah, that dive got the biggest reaction in the match so far.
Yes, that hooked the people, I think, completely by that point.
Absolutely. Back in the ring, Sasuke tries a German suplex, but Taka counters by flipping over and landing on his feet. Hits a Hurricanrana for a near fall. We got a really cool sequence as Taka hits a shoulder block that knocks Sasuke into the ropes. And then
sort of like lucha shoulder block that you see a lot of times. It then sets up a big offensive maneuver.
Yeah, he comes off the ropes and hits Taka with a handspring back elbow. Taka rolls to the floor. Sasuke then hits a springboard moonsault off the second rope to the outside, like an Asai moonsault. Awesome.
Yes, this was fantastic. This whole sequence, or a couple of sequences, like you said, Taka goes for the outside-in suplex to bring him back in. Sasuke flips out, goes for a German, but Taka flips out and hits a Frankensteiner for a Hurricanrana, Frankensteiner for a 2 count. Goes for a Mahistral, only a 2 count. Like you said, the whole sequence with the handspring elbow, they end up out on the floor. The Asai. I love here how JR then talks about how important this match is. And he doesn't say how important this match is for them in the WWF. He talks about how important this match is for their careers in Japan. And to the uninitiated, that might have sounded a little weird, but it could not have been more true in that neither of these guys were fully signed to the WWF at this point. And when guys went over from Japan and wrestled in the US, wrestled in WWF here, or more likely in WCW, it was a huge deal back home. You would a lot of times have guys that would even go over. Deals would be struck for wrestlers from Japan to go over and wrestle a dark match for the WWF with no intention of them being signed, no intention of anything else being done. But just the mere fact that those guys went over, wrestled, had their pictures taken by Japanese photographers, and then those pictures could be shown in the media in Japan, that would raise their profile here. So I raised their profile. So I thought it was really cool that Jim Ross mentioned that here.
Taka whips Sasuke into the corner, hits him in the face with a knee strike. Taka floats over to the outside, leaps to the top rope, nails Sasuke with a drop kick in the back. These people are into it big time.
Yes.
Michinoku driver, but Sasuke kicked out. I was absolutely stunned. I thought that was it. I was not expecting a kick out there at all. I thought, knowing Taka's history with WWF, I thought that was, that he was going to win, and he was going to win right there.
Yeah. Well, it was a long 2 count, and nobody does. Granted, it's his move, so it should be this way, but nobody does the Michinoku driver. Or it was actually originally the Michinoku driver number 2. I believe the original Michinoku driver. It was just what he called his brainbuster, but it's the Michinoku driver. It gets a huge pop, and he does it. Most guys, they just basically scoop a guy up for a body slam and then just do a sit out body slam. Taka scoops the guy up, leaps into the air, drives the guy down, and sits out the last second. It's just super visually impressive. And this was the point where I noted that Vince started to sound on commentary more impressed by Taka Michinoku than he was by the great Sasuke. Whether that's fair or not doesn't really matter. It's noteworthy because what would come after this for both men's careers in the WWF.
Yeah, Taka, this is the finishing sequence here. Taka off the top rope. Sasuke catches him with a drop kick on the way down. Moonsault by Sasuke, only a 2 count. Quick power bomb by Sasuke. He hooks the arms, tiger suplex, 3 count. And I did not expect that. I did not expect that to be the finish. I did not expect Sasuke to win this match. I thought Taka was going to win. This was so much fun. It was so fast-paced. We got some spectacular moves. WCW was way ahead of the game with the light heavyweights, but good for WWF for getting these 2 guys on the show. And the time of the match was 10 minutes, like you mentioned, but it was 10 minutes even. So I'd like to think that they told them that they had 10 minutes, and these guys just worked it out to the second.
Hit it on the dot for sure.
Hit it on the dot.
No, this was a great match, particularly in the environment that they were in. There were some really cool creative sequences. It was in a lot of ways them playing their greatest hits, what would have seemed like their greatest hits to a Japanese audience, but very, very good. The finish, like you said, Sasuke hitting his Thunderfire powerbomb, which is sort of a kind of almost starts in a razor's edge position. It's sort of an off to the side powerbomb. He holds him a little off to the side, not directly overhead, more of a over the shoulder type of deal. Hits the tiger suplex for the pin. Vince says, give both men credit. This was a great match. And like you said, this was WCW pay-per-views almost always in that like mid 95 through at least all of 97 and 98 into maybe early 98, always had a great cruiserweight match, at least one on the show. And it added so much to just the watchability of those pay-per-views. Like, you knew every time I ordered a WCW pay-per-view in that time period, I knew I might be aggravated as hell with, whatever was happening in the main events. It might be super frustrating, but I knew I was going to see, some combination of, Malenko, Guerrero, Ultimo Dragon, Rey Mysterio. You can go down the line. You're going to see some great match between those guys. This was maybe the only WWF pay-per-view I've ever seen from like that era or anything sort of adjacent to that era that had a match like that on the show. And it absolutely helped the overall watchability of this show.
To the back with Helmsley and Mankind again. They're fighting in the parking lot.
One quick thing back to Taka and Sasuke, because I wanted to make sure we mentioned this. We kind of hinted at it, that at the time, Sasuke was the guy they brought in. That was the whole reason they did this match. I think they had a match the next night on Raw, and then that was the last time Great Sasuke was ever in the WWF. They went on to sign Taka Michinoku, who had a several years long career as a regular performer in the WWF. So it was interesting how that all worked out.
WWF champion The Undertaker was supposed to defend his title against Ahmed Johnson, but 2 weeks ago on Raw, he suffered a knee injury, as Ahmed Johnson was wont to do, and he ended up having surgery, and he would be replaced with Vader in the match.
The man they call Vader, as he was always referred to in the WWF.
And we have Vader and Paul Bearer being interviewed in the back.
Did you have any recollection of Vader being managed by Paul Bearer? I did not. I chalk it up to the fact that I have blocked out pretty much the entirety of Vader's WWF career after, attacking Gorilla Monsoon and taking out, whatever, all the different things that he had very, very early on when they brought him in. After that, they just completely misused the guy. But I had zero recollection of this. Almost like when we talked about prior, we had zero recollection of him being managed by Jim Cornette. Same deal here.
Yes. I totally did not remember that. But then I remember Paul Bearer turning on The Undertaker so many times that, this is totally plausible that that I saw it. And I just chalked it up to that because
Also, what was with Paul Bearer not having the dyed black hair? He was like Percy Pringle cosplaying the Paul Bearer role here. It was weird.
Because so this was post his turn on the Undertaker, because we saw clips with Vader pinning the Undertaker at the Royal Rumble because Paul Bearer had turned on him, and he was in his full Paul Bearer gear at that point. But now, he's going Percy Pringle. He's going classic for his new Paul Bearer character, who tries to explain to us that the Undertaker is a murderer and he killed his entire family. Jeez.
Yeah, I almost spit my water out at this point. This is not a story that I had any memory of at all. And then as the match goes along, the announcers unfurl this soap opera like saga before us. I kind of start to remember.
I remember this is the introduction of Kane. This is how Kane ends up coming around. And
yes, they had not yet introduced that character. They start mentioning him. And fun fact, if you can call anything about Kane the Undertaker fun facts, do you remember the original name when Undertaker first debuted? It might not have actually been on TV, but he was introduced that way. And I know in the magazines they had him listed that way, that he was Kane the Undertaker.
Oh yeah, that's right.
That was the original character name. And so one would imagine when they came up with the idea to bring in his brother that they used that name from the cutting room floor.
I need someone to do an oral history on the Undertaker's storyline backstory, because there's so many things that I forgot, like that that he murdered his entire family, but his brother survived. There's all these, and like Paul Bearer was his dad, or he was Kane's dad, or something. There's like,
do you remember also that Royal Rumble? Whereas the match was it the match with Yokozuna, where like Yokozuna kills him, and then they like wheel him to like where the entranceway is. And then like there's a video on the very rudimentary Titantron, which wasn't a Titantron at that point. And his soul goes up the screen and then goes out. Like this was a thing that happened.
I need someone to do an oral history on the Undertaker's storyline backstory. If there's a Twitter or a Tumblr out there with this, or a blog somewhere that has this, please send it to.
I think you just created our new
random,
our new podcast. I think you just created our new limited run true crime podcast. There's not been a true crime, a true but not true crime wrestling podcast yet. This might be the first one.
Undertaker versus Vader, WWF Championship on the line. Vader had cool entrance music in WWF. While you did block out his run, he did. I liked Vader's cool entrance music. I wish he still had his headpiece, though. That was always my favorite part of the Vader entrance.
Yes, I also didn't like, and he had this, I think, towards the end of his WCW run. Maybe I'm wrong, but like the Vader time in like a very friendly, non-threatening font on the front of his gear.
That's right.
That took away from some of the aura of Vader, and that honestly to me was like the theme of this match, was that this should have been so much bigger of a deal than it was. Vader versus the Undertaker for the WWF title here in front of a hot crowd in Calgary, and the crowd was with it, but just the presentation of Vader here, he's a replacement, and we'll talk about it as the match rolls out. Pretty much the only time Vader, the most dominant big man maybe in wrestling history, the only time Vader is able to get offense is when Paul Bearer interferes on his behalf. It infuriated me, and it made me remember why I forgot so much of his WWF run.
We've mentioned how great JR has been on this show. Paul Bearer is cowering, trying to hide during the Undertaker's entrance, and JR has a great line where he goes, "It's kind of hard to hide when you're 400 pounds." Awesome.
It was awesome, and it was also in the great lineage of super exaggerating wrestlers' weights, so that it was on brand as well. And then Lawler did actually have a good line where it's like, "What are you? You're one to talk."
Yeah.
It's like JR was not much smaller than Paul Bearer here.
Those two were bickering all night. It was very, very funny.
I will say Lawler was far more tolerable here. He still was annoying, but this was pre like all the sexual innuendo just nonstop in WWF on commentary. And so he was not Bobby Heenan here. He was not Jesse Ventura, but he was perfectly fine.
All Taker early. Taker hits the classic rope walk, strike to the back, the old school for a near fall. Taker's brother, who he hasn't seen in 20 years, is coming. That will be Kane, like we just mentioned.
But it was weird. They say he just learned that he has a long-lost brother, but in the same sentence, they say that he thought his long-lost brother had been dead for the past 20 years.
Yeah, right now it's just, you murdered your family, but your brother is alive. Vince...
And then that's the theme on commentary throughout this match, is that Taker really should be able to take Vader, but he might be too distracted by allegations that he murdered his brother and his family.
So while they're explaining about his murdering tendencies, the crowd is cheering on his moves in the ring. So Vince explains that crowds all around the world are forgiving of whatever the Undertaker has done. WWF fans are totally cool with you murdering your family. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they'll still buy your black and purple foam fingers, I guess. There were a couple other great lines in this. Like the match starts hot, and like you said, it is just Taker just dominating Vader like Vader's a total jobber. But JR then says, "This will not be a Briscoe Funk classic," which I liked. He was just setting the tone. This was going to be a brawl, a slobber knocker. And then JR got in another one of his great, pro wrestling is actually more than WWF type of lines, where he talks about Vader dominating Japan. And then at that point, Vader hits his sort of standing Vader bomb. It's not a splash, but it's sort of just flying, clubbing body attack where he hits you with all of his weight and kind of hits you with both of his arms around you as well. He hits that, and then Taker sits up immediately.
Yeah, Taker ends up booting Vader over the top to the floor. On the outside, Taker gets sent knees first into the steps. Paul Bearer's taunting Taker on the floor. Taker ends up hitting a clothesline off the top rope, near fall only. JR notes that Vader was trained by Brad Riggins. Who,
yes, I loved that. I was a callback to our AWA Super Sunday
AWA
episode.
Super Sunday podcast featured Brad Riggins. So
I was disappointed that he did not call him Bradley Reingans.
Yes.
I was very disappointed. We also had
Trongard for JR.
No. There was not a head cracker. Was that a Ron Trongardism? JR also does talk about that Vader might be the best big man ever. And at that point, I'm imagining like Vince shutting his microphone off and slapping him over the head. Not because it's not right, because it is, but because that is not the narrative that they were going for in the WWF right now at all.
Taker is stalking Paul Bearer, and JR goes, "Paul Bearer is waddling for his life." That was hilarious. Vader ends up hitting him from behind. Paul Bearer gets some shots in on the downed Undertaker. Vader finally gets some offense now, like you mentioned, thanks to the interference. Vader's in control. Suplex, splash, only a near fall. Taker fires up with body shots, big uppercut, but a finger to the eye gives Vader the advantage again. But not for long, as Taker grabs him by the neck for the chokeslam. Vader kicks Undertaker right in the balls, kicking him low right in front of the referee, to where JR even said, "Not sure why the ref didn't DQ him there." This was JR channeling his AEW commentary somehow, like retroactively in 1997. JR was so upset that this was not a disqualification here. He is a former referee and a stickler for the rules. As am I, and I like, at least try a distraction, especially when you got Paul Bearer out there. This was very blatant. Vader goes up for the Vader bomb. Like you mentioned, Taker sits up, gets up, punches Vader low, again in front of the ref. Taker then grabs Vader by the throat, choke slams him off the second rope. Only a 2 count. Taker with another choke slam, 2 again. Tombstone, this time a 3 count. Still champion, The Undertaker. This match was totally fine. 2 big men. It was, quite a change of pace from the previous light heavyweight match. But, it was still good big men that were agile and having a good match. It was a totally fine Undertaker Vader match.
It was okay. The problem is that there should not be a totally fine Undertaker Vader match. This is two of the best big men in the history of professional wrestling, and this was a match. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great. It just
totally
existed. And this was, it was still relatively early in Vader's WWF run, but also not, I guess. And you've heard him talk about through the years afterward. He's obviously since passed away, but he talked about how his time in WWF just took all of his confidence away. And you could see parts of that here. There was a very awkward stretch where Vader locks on as being gracious. It looks as though he's got Undertaker down on the mat. Undertaker is sitting up, and at first it seems as though he's just picking the Undertaker up, but then he doesn't pick him up. He just keeps his hands on the Undertaker's shoulder or like on his trapezius muscle, but he's not like squeezing at all. He's not trying to make it look like he's squeezing at all. There's no exertion. And so the Undertaker isn't reacting and exerting at all. This goes on for like 15 seconds. It feels like 15 minutes. And then finally Taker realizes, oh, this is supposed to be a nerve hold, and starts wincing. But it was kind of sad to see because Vader was so great, but he was locked into having to wrestle WWF style here. And it was weird. There was also a spot relatively early in the match where Vader just locks on a side headlock to just like kill time, because that's what you do in WWF, is do rest holds. And it just felt weird. So I knew kind of what the story was with Vader in WWF, so I didn't think this was going to be some blowaway match. But still, when you see Vader and Undertaker and you know how hot this crowd is, you're still kind of hoping it's going to be a little bit more than what it was.
12 minutes, 39 seconds on that match. And now it's main event time. We've got Farmer's Daughter, a group singing the Canadian national anthem. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to tell you about this national anthem. I was 100% convinced that for some reason they had brought in American pop group Wilson Phillips to do this show. I thought they were going to start telling us to hold on for one more day and things will go our way.
This is the Canadian version of that.
This was the Canadian version of Wilson Phillips, right down to the haircut. And this was not the best Canadian national anthem I've ever heard, but it was perfect to have an anthem done to set the scene, set the tone for the absolute pandemonium that awaited us.
Ralph Klein, the premier of Alberta, is introduced. Stu and Helen Hart, with the sons that aren't in WWE, and all the grandchildren are introduced at ringside.
Before we get any further, though, can we just briefly mention the video package and promo before this?
Sure.
Because they cut to the video of the Harts out and about in Calgary, but like I don't think they realized that it was the exact same video they had shown earlier, and so they immediately cut away from it, and so that was weird. And then they go into this the video package they were probably intending to show, which is this long video deal where they say recent events have led to mayhem and full-fledged brawls everywhere. And I'm wondering where this is going, because at first they're showing the Nation of Domination, they're showing the Disciples of the Apocalypse, which is this horrible biker gang group that Crush Brian Adams was involved in. I also had completely forgotten that Savio Vega apparently had a gang of his
Bariquas.
own. Yes, yeah. Los Bariquas. So like they're showing all these geeks fighting each other, and I'm like, what is going on? And then they're like, all of these pale in comparison to the battle between Stone Cold Steve Austin and the Harts. And it was actually cool, but it was a weird setup. And then we get a long video back and forth of everything that's happened. And then they have a great line. It's 10 men, 1 brawl. The countdown to chaos in Calgary is complete. The moment of mayhem has arrived. Then we go from that backstage. We see Doc Hendricks, Michael PSA's again, wearing his cowboy hat and his bolo tie. And the collection of human beings that he has before him. This rogues gallery, this motley crew of men that Steve Austin has put together. It is Stone Cold Steve Austin, the world's most dangerous man, Ken Shamrock, Goldust, and the Legion of Doom, Road Warrior Hawk and Road Warrior Animal. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of screaming. The one thing that I hadn't thought about in a while was how dumb Ken Shamrock's gimmick was in the WWF. So like this guy is, hot off of being in the UFC. He's a huge star. He's like, along with Hoist Gracie, the first real star of the UFC. Great look, guy's in great shape, the whole deal. But his gimmick as this like disciplined MMA fighter, his gimmick is that he gets in the zone and then goes crazy.
If I heard like, in the zone one more time.
Oh, every single time. I forgot his promo talk. He's like, I just enter the zone. And then we hear throughout this match, he's in the zone. It was also noteworthy that everyone else is yelling and screaming. And then so like they each get their turn. And then we expect Austin to cut a promo. And instead Austin just walks away and they all go to the ring because this is an uneasy alliance. Stone Cold Steve Austin does not want to have to work with any of these men. He wants to do it all on his own, but he knows he can't take on the entire Hart family and the entire city of Calgary on his own. So this is what he had to put together.
And their opponents are the Hart Foundation, which is Bret Hitman Hart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, Owen Hart, the British Bulldog, and Brian Pillman. And during these intros, holy cow, you've got some cheers for Austin during his intro, but mostly boos and middle fingers at Austin.
Yes.
The place absolutely erupted when Bret Hart was introduced.
Not even just Bret. The introductions were like better than most matches on a show because they bring out Pillman first and the crowd is at a fever pitch. Pillman comes out and Pillman is just
trying to hype up the crowd.
Yeah, he is just getting them going more and more, And then they, first interview Neidhart, who for some reason, or they introduce, I should say, Jim Neidhart. Crowd is going crazy. Vince calls Jim Neidhart a big, nasty rhino on commentary. Okay. Then British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, who is the European champion, gets introduced. Then Owen Hart gets introduced, and the place is losing their minds. Owen with the Intercontinental title, his slammies, and a very Bret Hole, close cut, new haircut for Owen Hart here. And then they introduce Owen. Like I said, that happens. Then there's a pause. And the crowd, you can just hear at a fever pitch. Bret's music hits. You can barely hear Howard Finkel introducing Bret Hart here. And I write down in my notes, this is Von Erichs and Dallas level heat as Bret comes out. And this, in a lot of ways, the crowd heat is the story of this match.
That absolutely
I would make the argument that this might be the last time you ever saw crowd heat like this in pro wrestling, like where it was not about like fans trying to get themselves over. There weren't chants in terms of like, this is awesome, or, you still got it. This was pure, unadulterated love for five men, hatred for five other men, civic pride, all just in this stew that came out to like what you would see in the hottest angles of the territory days, in the South. It was incredible.
JR mentions a documentary crew at ringside filming Bret Hart. We now know that they were filming the Wrestling with Shadows documentary, and I was looking at him going, you have no idea the doc you're shooting is going to completely change narratives in November at the Survivor Series in Montreal.
Yes, yeah, I had very similar notes written down. I thought that was I was not expecting to hear that on the commentary, and yeah, all 10 men jawing in the ring before the refs can separate it out. And then what do we have to start this match? What everybody came here to see: Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin start, and they are throwing down. They are throwing haymakers back and forth, just off the charts intensity to start this deal.
Yeah, Hitman beating on Austin in the corner as he's beating him down. The place is going so crazy that you can see the hard camera actually shaking.
Yes, and this was not like a Kevin Dunn, let's shake the camera around to give everybody vertigo. This was literally the sheer force of noise, whether it be from people cheering, people stomping. The camera was shaking. It was like, was it the 89 World Series with the earthquake?
Yeah.
That's what this looked like.
And JR made mention to it that this was the most wild crowd. You could feel the building shaking, and we could see it. Like, it was absolutely nuts to see how
no
crazy
hyperbole.
No. And Austin starts fighting back on Brett. Thunderous booing. Every bit of offense by Brett, the place goes nuts. And anytime Austin would do anything, the place was just hating him. It was absolutely, the heat was off the charts. Unbelievable.
We also had, at this point, we have Austin hits a low blow. He goes into the mud stomping, the stomping a mud hole. And then we get something that I thought was a couple really cool callbacks. He locks on the Cobra Clutch, or the $1 Million Dream, which in a long forgotten, very short portion of Steve Austin's career, if you remember, when he came in after his WCW run, after his ECW run, Steve Austin was not even called Steve Austin initially. He was the Ringmaster. He still had hair, and he was managed by the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, who gave him the $1 Million belt and gave him the $1 Million Dream as his finisher. So this was, at least a year later, a callback here. As he has Brett locked in this Cobra Clutch, we then see Brett use the same reversal that he used to defeat Roddy Piper for the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania, 5 years prior?
Yeah, WrestleMania 8.
Yep. Where he's locked in the Cobra Clutch. That was a regular sleeper in that instance, but here he's locked in the Cobra Clutch. He maneuvers his way to the ropes, walks his way up the turnbuckles, and then pushes back into a pinning combination, but he doesn't get the pin here. I love that.
A lot of good callbacks. You mentioned the Austin low blow. People were legit angry. It wasn't like wrestling booing. People were angry that Austin hit a low blow and ruined this good wrestling that was happening.
No, the heat in this match and in that spot, that was a good example of it. This wasn't like, I'm going to the wrestling show and I'm going to have a good time cheering the good guys and booing the bad guys. This was, I went out to the bar with my brother and some drunk guy punched my brother and I want to kill him. That's what this heat was. It was something to see.
I could watch Austin and Brett all night. They were so smooth. The chemistry that they had together. We talked about Mankind and Helmsley's chemistry. Austin and Brett were
another level.
Another level.
And the chemistry was like you said, in one breath, when they were wrestling and like working holds back and forth, they could be so smooth, but then they were also capable of just this wild, out of control brawling and intensity that worked every bit as well. Like it's a shame that did not last or could not have been called back to many years later, just given the direction that both guys' careers went.
Anvil tags in. Austin gets a Thez press on him. Shamrock comes in with Anvil. The crowd was literally chanting Anvil.
Yes.
That's how hot this crowd is.
Yeah. Well, it was fascinating because they knuckled up. Like they both got in like battle stances. It was funny to see Jim Neidhart in like MMA or no holds barred at that point, as it was called, fighting stance with Shamrock here.
Ankle lock attempt by Shamrock. Pillman in, and Pillman with Shamrock. He hits a backbreaker, goes for the cover, and he grabs Shamrock's hand and slams it to the mat, yelling, "He's tapping out." I love the loose cannon Brian Pillman character.
Well, yes, he was fantastic. And this was, physically, he was completely broken down at this point. He had the motorcycle accident or whatever accident he had that just completely destroyed his ankle and it had to be fused into place. He was, as a wrestler, nowhere near what he had been years prior. But it almost didn't matter because he was just such a force of nature as a character by this point.
Owen and Goldust are in. Thunderous Owen chants. This crowd is incredible. Hawk's in there with Owen. Hits a bunch of his classic spots. Then hits a huge splash off the top.
I was not expecting that at all. I figured for sure he was going to either Owen was going to move or Owen was going to get the knees up.
And any normal crowd would be going nuts for the Road Warriors here.
Yeah.
But this crowd is quiet. They're yelling Austin sucks, or they're just cheering for Owen. It was absolutely weird, but great. It was a super unique dynamic all around. Brett puts Goldust in a tree of woe, hooking him upside down in the Hart Foundation corner. 5-on-1 beatdown in the corner. This is the same guy who was talking about 5-on-5 in fairness earlier.
Exactly, but it didn't matter because they were in Calgary, and the crowd didn't care about fairness. They just wanted to see
people loved it.
They just wanted to see their guys win. One other thing I wanted to mention is right around this time, Goldust makes a save, and then he gets in. At one point, he gets in and has a brief exchange with Brett. It's fascinating to see the difference between the wrestler Goldust on this show as compared to his TV debut that we covered on the first episode of this podcast at that In Your House show. He is, for one, he's a face here. In the backstage promo before this, they basically say, or he says, he's the one who got these 5 guys on the same page to be a team. And even though he is wearing the Goldust gear, he is, for all intents and purposes, wrestling as Dustin Rhodes in terms of his in-ring style, which is a big departure.
Well, and JR mentioned it, that they're both second-generation wrestlers.
He mentioned he's the son of Dusty.
Uh-huh. So yeah, that's come a long way in 2 years.
And that's something I would have killed to see more of. Would have been like early 90s, like 92, 93 Dustin Rhodes with Bret Hart from pretty much any point from that point forward on into the mid to late 90s.
Owen in the ring with Road Warrior Animal. Owen hits a drop kick off the top, does a kip up. The place goes absolutely crazy again. This crowd is so hot. We keep mentioning it, but it needs to be mentioned because they were a member of this match, if not the MVP of this match. So.
For sure. And this is a great match. We'll talk about as it goes on, just how, at least I'll mention how much this differs from the normal WWF vibe. But yes, this crowd is honestly, as much as we've watched different territory stuff on this to review on this podcast so far, I think this is by far the wildest, most energetic, best crowd we've seen on these 10 episodes to date.
Owen goes for a Hurricane Rana, but is countered by Animal into a powerbomb. Animal and Hawk hit the Doomsday device on Owen. Anvil has to come in to make the save. Breaks down with all 10 men in the ring.
A full line brawl, NHL style here in the home of the Calgary Flames.
Austin grabs Owen, slams his knee into the ring post. Then Austin hits Owen's knee with a chair. Owen's brother, Bruce Hart, at ringside, grabs Austin from his front row seat, but he couldn't stop him. Brett comes over to make the save. Huge Austin sucks chance, and Owen is hurt. He's getting medical attention.
What's awesome about this too, this whole thing starts, like you said, there's the 5-on-5 line brawl, and but Austin sort of like Owen ends up going to the floor, and then Austin sneaks away like a thief in the night. Like everybody else is still brawling. Nobody's paying attention to what's going on with Owen. Austin sneaks away from him and rams his knee in the post. And like you said, things start going crazy with the Hart family out in front. But I enjoyed that touch. And then at this point, the announcers start talking about that it might very well be 5-on-4. And as the action continues, we see Owen get taken to the back to deal with his injury, and it is in fact at this point 5-on-4 in favor of, I guess they're not really the heels, but they are the heels in this match. This is the Team Austin, as it were.
Anvil gets Austin into the corner. 4-on-1 Hart Foundation attack on Austin, like you mentioned, because Owen's in the back. Austin's able to fight his way out, though, and that was absolutely awesome. Like, he fought his way out of the 4-on-1. We saw a 5-on-1 beatdown earlier. Austin fights his way out of the 4-on-1. He hits a stunner on Pillman.
Which, I just have to say, the very, very, very brief interaction of Austin and Pillman here made me so happy because I loved Austin and Pillman as a team. The Hollywood Blondes, oh my God. Sonny Steve Austin was absolutely 100% my guy when I was going to WCW shows in 1992. When they became a team in 93 and then became named the Hollywood Blondes, absolutely loved them. So anytime there's any Austin Pillman interaction, whether it's back then, whether it's here, whether it's the crazy angle on Raw with the gun, just bring me all the Austin and Pillman together all the time.
So after the Austin stunner on Pillman, Bret Hart on the outside grabs Austin's leg, pulls him over to the ring post. Payback time. Payback time for Austin as his knee is rammed into the post. Then Bret hits Austin's knee with a fire extinguisher.
Yes, he one-ups the chair shot. He grabs the fire extinguisher, which had been laying under the ring, hits him several times with it, and then hits him with or locks on one of my favorite moves in wrestling. But we've talked about it. It's a dangerous move for the guy doing it. The around the ring post figure 4, because it's pretty much impossible to not crack your head on the mat as you do it. And that also, looking back at Brett's career and how it would end via concussions, now whenever I see him go back and see him do that move and see him hit his head, I'm like, oh, maybe that wasn't worth it.
Animal has to come over to break it up and make the save for Austin. The officials take Austin to the back for medical attention, just like they did with Owen Hart moments ago. It's 4-on-4 now. Shamrock is in there with Brett.
This, by the way, I just want to mention, this was the only part of the match, literally the only part of the match that didn't work for me.
Yep.
Was Austin having his knee worked over a little bit and then willingly going to the back, particularly with what we see later. And I understand for what they were doing with the match, they kind of boxed themselves in the corner that they had to do this, but it fell flat big time for me.
Well, JR was trying to mention that, Austin isn't, he's got a bad knee. He's wearing a knee brace already. He's, this could be a pretty damaging injury. So
true, but it still did not fit with the Steve Austin character at all.
Shamrock's in there with Hart. He's got Hart's leg and has no idea what to do. This
was so weird.
He's, quote, looking for a submission, but he's not doing anything. It was really weird.
It was very, very strange. He just stands there for a long time. What I think was supposed to happen here, I think Pillman was supposed to come in right away and clothesline him. And that doesn't happen. So I think he's basically waiting for Pillman.
Yeah.
And, Ken Shamrock, not an overly experienced pro wrestler. He had done a decent amount of pro wrestling before, the more shoot/work shoot stuff in Pancrase, and then obviously a fighter in the UFC. But he did not know what to do here. He did not know how to improvise when Pillman was late. And so it was very awkward.
Yeah, but then Pillman finally runs in. He hits Shamrock, but then Shamrock does the same thing again. This time... This time he lets Brett up so that he can get him into fighting position, fists up,
yeah. The best part is, so he hesitates again. He lets Brett up so they can knuckle up, and then Brett just immediately locks up with him and knees him in the stomach. And I just howled with laughter. This was so bad, but I loved it.
Yeah,
Brett, you can tell Brett was just like, enough of this nonsense. This has to stop. We're going back into a wrestling match here. I'm doing this.
Bulldog ends up putting a beating on Shamrock, and the crowd erupts again. Shamrock's able to escape and tag by using a low blow. Bulldog hits the scariest superplex ever on Goldust.
Oh my God. This was...
They could not get their footing. They could not get their footing, and Bulldog just ended up muscling him over for that superplex. Absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, in the end, it worked. They didn't get hurt, but it was two big dudes struggling to work together to execute a very dangerous move that could go wrong in 1,000 different ways. But yeah, he hits it. Hawk makes the save, and then we have a return from the back.
Austin, limping, comes back down to join his team. They now have the 5-on-4 advantage, and Austin tags in immediately with Brett. Austin and Brett go back and forth, and it's just as awesome as it was at the beginning of the match. Just awesome.
Yeah, wild haymakers. Very, like you said, very similar to the start of the match, but even more sort of fatigued intensity in the crowd at even more of a fever pitch. Like you said, you can never go wrong with these two guys in the ring together.
Hitman's got the sharpshooter on Austin, but Animal immediately breaks it up. Austin puts the sharpshooter on Brett, and Owen comes down the ramp into the ring and breaks it up. 5-on-5 again. Owen, the hero, returning. Austin and Owen fight to the floor. Austin gets Owen against the guardrail right in front of his family at ringside.
This is like the whole family. This is
grandchildren and everything.
This is Stu and Helen. Bruce Hart trying to look as much as he can like Bret Hart, which is a theme for his career. Other random Hart brothers. You have got 8-year-old granddaughters at ringside. Like, it is the whole family.
Yeah, he's kicking and beating him down. Then Bruce throws his drink at Austin, who turns around and grabs old man Stu Hart.
This is amazing. This is so great.
Bruce and the other Hart brothers jump the rail as Brett comes over, too. They're all attacking Austin. Brett throws Austin into the ring. Owen rolls up Austin for the 3 count and the win. All hell breaks loose in the ring. Cops and security are trying to break it up.
Somehow more family members than we knew were there are coming in. But the crazy thing about this, like the brawl is wild. All hell breaks loose, as you said. The announcers never, ever, ever referenced that Owen Hart pinned Steve Austin. Howard Finkel announces the Harts as the winners. The announcers completely missed the pin and never mention it.
Yeah, the Hart Foundation are announced as winners, and Canada celebrates. All of Canada celebrates at once. Austin then comes back in with a chair and nails Neidhart in the back.
Well, this is the thing, too, is like they're celebrating for a while. Like, you're almost thinking this is how it's going to go off. And then, yeah, Austin comes back in and he's got a chair trying to beat them down, but the entire Hart family stops him.
Oh, no, he's immediately jumped by all of Canada. All of Canada stops him. As everyone is on Austin, Brett gets on top of the pile and is laying in a ton of punches. They look
so great,
so brutal, and so awesome. And Austin gets handcuffed by security to get him out of there. Austin's walking up the ramp, hands cuffed behind his back, and he's still flipping off the crowd as he leaves. Stone Cold is amazing. Amazing.
This was the Stone Cold Steve Austin character at its absolute best. And one of the other things that I loved about this was in a lot of ways one of, if not the only times that we saw the Austin character at his height doing heelish things and getting booed and then being more heelish in response. I mean, everywhere else, like, he was pretty much a heel, obviously, in the US, but it didn't matter because he was so beloved. That was part of why he was beloved. It was a really cool, like, the whole thing was like a flip of the script, but seeing Austin get to do that with that intensity and get booed, and like, you know how much he loved that. It was fantastic.
Stu Hart at 82 years old gets in the ring to celebrate. The grandkids, all the Hart family celebrates. They just keep coming. There's so many Hart family members. This is a very cool ending. There's so many Harts celebrating in the ring as the show goes off the air. Absolutely phenomenal finish.
Yes, and this was, a phenomenal finish. The thing I loved about this match was WWF usually did not do wild, chaotic brawls well. This was 35 minutes of wild, chaotic brawling that felt like it was teetering on the edge of completely breaking down in the best possible way. And it was just fantastic. You love to see that. And again, the crowd, a lot of the show outside of the stuff with the Undertaker, this just didn't feel like a WWF show. And I mean that in a complimentary way. So that was the one thing I wanted to note. The other thing that I wanted to note, sitting here watching the end of this show, watching the Hart family all together, this was arguably like the pinnacle of the Hart family as a whole of their wrestling careers. You had the whole family in the ring, grandparents, parents, grandchildren, everybody's kids, all of Canada, like you said, in the ring. The crowd through the roof, this huge, super successful show. They're celebrating. And then I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, this is like the last real moment like this they would ever have, at least professionally. You think of, like, you're watching this match and all 4 of Bret Hart's partners in this match, either family members or family friends, are no longer alive. You think of everything that happened in short order after this. You think of Brian Pillman passing away not that long after this. You think of the Survivor Series screw job with Bret Hart and his relationship with WWF ending on incredibly bad terms. You think of the horrific tragedy that happened with Owen Hart. Davey Boy Smith passing away young, Jim Neidhart passing away a couple years ago. And it's this incredible scene at the end of this show that is a moment in time. And then it's tinged with the sadness of knowing what awaited this family.
Yeah, it was definitely a peak moment for this family, and hopefully it was as special for them as it was for us getting to watch it at home as well. And your thoughts on the best match of the show? For me, it's the main event. What do you think?
Yeah, it's, as someone who loves Japanese professional wrestling as much as I do, and loved that match between Taka Michinoku and the great Sasuke, and loved just how much it stood out as this oddity in the history of the WWF. There's no way I can say it's anything but that main event. That was just
that dynamic, that crowd, the
performance
by Austin and Brett and Owen and everyone involved. Absolutely easy runaway best match.
Absolutely. It was one of those things that you would love as a pro wrestling fan to be able to bottle up and sell, or just be able to bottle up and open and sprinkle on other shows that don't have that level of heat and that level of intensity. It was everything that, in a lot of ways, it's everything that's great about pro wrestling, or what you want to see in a pro wrestling match. It was just, again, it's not one of those like 6-star bell to bell mat classics, but it shouldn't have been. It was a wild, chaotic, unhinged brawl with deep emotional connections between the wrestlers and the fans. And it's through the 10 or so episodes we've done of this show, it's right in the top tier of my favorite matches that we've watched and reviewed for this podcast.
The worst match, I'm sure we're in agreement. Not a lot of matches to choose from. It was probably the Taker Vader match, I assume.
Yeah, I even with the opening match not having a finish, I really liked that match.
So did I. Yeah.
Other than the finish, which again, as the match went along, or as the night went along, and we saw them continuing to brawl, it kind of made sense why they did that finish. It didn't bother me at all. Taker Vader on paper should be like an all-time big man classic, and this was, it was just a match. It was fine. But yeah,
it didn't feel like a pay-per-view title match. Felt more like a Raw main event.
It felt like it felt like what it was, which is Vader as an injury replacement in a match that should have been like, you look at Vader and Undertaker, and Vader's title should have been in serious, or Taker's title should have been in serious doubt. But I don't think anybody really thought Vader had any chance of winning. And that's just, if you're booking Vader in a world title match and people don't think he has a chance of winning, the problem is with you as a booker. And so, yeah, that kind of carried through into the quality of the match. And it was still good, but if there's a disappointment on the show, that was it.
If you haven't seen this show, go watch this show.
2 thumbs up. It is so good, so unique, incredible crowd, and it is easy to watch.
Such
an hour and 48 minutes. Like, you will not be disappointed if you watch this show.
Every single Thursday, we're going to post on social media what event that week's episode will cover. So make sure you're following us on all the platforms, Twitter and Instagram, at WrestleAtRandom. It's also the best way to interact with the show. Send us a message, send us a tweet. We will respond to every single one of them. Facebook.com/WrestlingAtRandom. And of course, WrestlingAtRandom.com is the website that brings you the entire back catalog of this podcast, all the links to subscribe via your podcatcher of choice. And make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. That helps others find the show. It helps us work the algorithm so that people can find this show. And make sure you tell your wrestling fan friends about us. We're relying on your word of mouth. Spread the word about this show. Tell your past wrestling fan friends about it, because even though they don't watch it today, there's a lot of good classic stuff on here. So make sure that you're sending all of your friends this way to support the show. And with that, we're going to wrap up this week's show. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. This was a really fun show to watch, and I'm thrilled that we were able to scratch it off of our list of shows we've never seen, and I'm equally thrilled that it lived up to my expectations.
It absolutely did. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.